Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Hsieh, and Erika Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership. Welcome to the ESG Decoded podcast. I'm Amanda Hsieh. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that really, I think, extends beyond the sustainability teams into really all parts of the company, including risk management and strategy. We're going to be talking about leading practices in managing climate risk and also compliance with EU and US climate disclosure laws and regulations. I'm excited to be joined by my colleague Amanda Mast and Kate Rodgers and John Liddell from Mitiga Solutions. I'm going to pass it over to y'all and do some round of introductions so everyone can learn a little bit about you. Amanda, do you mind going first?
Happy to. So I'm Amanda Mast, a senior manager with ClimeCo's sustainability, policy, and advisory team. And that means I get to help both our corporate and government clients set their sustainability strategies, but then also implement that strategy and report their progress. And one of the services I get to specialize in is our climate risk and opportunity assessments, which are becoming increasingly important. And we'll talk about that in a second. But just want to say I'm so grateful that we've been able to find a partner in Mitiga whose climate data and climate assessment models we can really rely on for insights as we help our customers navigate the space. So Kate and John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Amanda. Kate, do you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Kate Rodger and I head up the sales team for Mitiga Solutions and particularly for our platform Earthscan. Earthscan was the first global climate risk platform and I've had the pleasure of working with it since its inception about 5 years ago. I know my colleague John was not far behind me. And I've really seen the evolution of how the business world is starting to think about climate risks and embedding them into decisions. My background has been in a customer-facing role in artificial intelligence or deep tech startups, but I'm now fully dedicated to the climate tech space. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the podcast. John, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is John Liddell. I am the head of customer success here at Mitiga Solutions, which is a very fancy title for someone who gets to speak to all of our customers all day, every day about all of their climate risk and regulation needs. As Kate said, I've been working here for around 4 years now, but I've seen climate risks and the opportunities that surround them and worked with all of our customers for all of that time. Whether they are one-person consultancies, whether they are large multinational corporates, we've worked with them all, and it's great to understand how climate change will affect them.
Well, let's jump right into it then, John. Tell us more about what are climate-related risks. I think it's so complex and sometimes it's just hard to grasp. So will you please just set the table for us and help us understand it?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's important to note that there are several different types of climate-related risks, and Mitiga Solutions specializes in what are physical risks. So physical risks are those climate-related phenomena that we can expect to see in the 21st century. So that is the increased heat waves that will come as a result of climate change, those longer droughts, and higher precipitation levels, to name but a few. The way in which physical risks also work is that they can further be split out into both acute and chronic risks. Acute physical risks can be thought of as shock events, which may or may not be short-lived. Think about severe flooding, localized. These are often thought of as acute risks, whereas chronic risks are often longer term in nature and have different impacts on your assets. So an example of a chronic risk is heat waves. Now, heat waves will often last longer than a significant short, sharp shock, like a flood event, but can have real chronic long-term results, as well as risks for your business. Both cause significant risks, but more often than not, businesses tend to focus on those acute risks as they're more prevalent in media, and frankly, they're easier to understand the potential business impact for them. But Earthscan, our platform, helps companies such as ClimeCo try and help other organizations understand the impacts that physical risks will have throughout the course of the 21st century.
Thank you for that, John. And I guess my question, I think you touched on this a little bit, is why is it important for companies to have a strong handle on their climate related risks? Kate, you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. That is a very difficult question. What you're asking for is what is the return on investment of investing in climate related risks and understanding them, which unfortunately is a really difficult question to answer because climate change is a long term phenomenon. And within companies, within society, within governments, we're so fixated on short term metrics, short term profit, and short term policies. However, I am definitely seeing this that businesses are under increasing pressure now to start thinking about the business case, the value of understanding and acting upon their climate risks. At Mitiga, we often say that business are experiencing pressure from three different sections. The first section, which I find more prevalent now, is from the financial impact of climate change, of more frequent and more volatile climate related events. So at Mitiga, we actually often hear from companies who have just experienced a flood that caused direct damage to the likes of a factory or a commercial real estate property, or even, as John just touched upon, a chronic risk like a heat wave that could have reduced footfall if they were a retailer, or even impacted worker or machine productivity in a manufacturing asset. So that business leader has suddenly realized that the impact of climate related risks and events has had an impact on their bottom line. I actually read earlier this year a survey conducted by Capgemini where they interviewed over 500 business leaders, and just under 50%, 48% of them believe that climate change will cause the majority of operational disruptions in the coming decade. Now, that's saying that climate change is no longer something that will impact us in the far future, but is actually something that's impacting those business leaders right now. And so those business leaders are starting to conclude that starting to invest in understanding and building resilience far outweighs the cost of inaction and ultimately reduces the cost of the impacts of climate related events. The second pressure point, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot because you can't avoid it in a discussion about climate risks, is that regulatory pressure. Many countries are enforcing stricter climate risk regulations. John and I are based in the UK, and I'm in Barcelona, Spain, so in the European Union, and John in the UK. And we're seeing the likes of EU taxonomy and CSRD reporting really starting to dictate and dominate the to-do list of sustainability leaders. And of course, in the UK and other geographies, TCFD reporting. So even companies that are headquartered in countries like the US that haven't had to thus far report on their climate-related risks, they might have a global presence. And so they might be mandated to report on their climate-related risks in the European Union. So the business case here is that they have to do it. They're mandated to report. And these standards and these frameworks are getting much harder to complete and to do. You can't just conduct a tick box exercise to meet these standards anymore. You really, as an organization, have to demonstrate a thorough understanding of your climate risks and actually often have to show how to plan for mitigation and adaptation strategies, which is exactly how we work with ClimeCo. The third pressure point is also reporting, but it's not coming from regulation. But we're seeing organizations getting increasing demands from their entire B2B value chain. So that could be from investors, it could be from shareholders, consumers, buyers, suppliers, tenants. It depends on the industry you're from. But they're under more pressure and more demands for more transparent climate-related reporting. And companies can face reputational risk and even often reduced access to capital if they don't produce or they can't produce a scientifically rigorous and comprehensive report. And I touched upon in my introduction that I've been working this space for 5 years. I think out of those three pressure points, regulation was often the main driver. And for many organizations, it's really, really complex. But I do think that the business case is now moving much more to risk reduction and cost saving and building that operational resilience within an organization. We have some great customers with some great examples about how they're being more proactive to avoid the costs of climate-related events in the future.
I think Kate summarized that perfectly, but would love to double down on a few of the points from the US perspective, mostly to say that we're seeing the same drivers here. So, we've seen companies for years building out their own resiliency by following the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, again, from a voluntary standpoint. But the big shift that we're experiencing now, a few years behind those preparing for CSRD in the EU, is this shift from a voluntary context to a compliance space, which does really change, I think, the level of focus, the level of investment, and the desire for robust data that firms may have looked for in the past. So in particular, we're seeing California Senate Bill 261 focus specifically on climate-related financial risk, including reference to TCFD and, by extension, scenario analysis, which we'll get to in a little bit, and the SEC releasing their final rules on climate-related disclosures. Again, a huge portion of that is focused on risk and risk mitigation and risk disclosure. Should note that both of those are facing litigation currently, but I think there's a strong sense that we know the direction of travel. It is to effectively understand the risks of each business, to be able to explain how those risks are being mitigated to customers, to investors, and other stakeholders, so firms can say we will be competitive moving forward as this context evolved. And I think, not only will thousands of firms be impacted directly by these pieces of legislation and rules, but also, as Kate mentioned too, climate risks are not limited to the four walls of a single firm. Instead, your risk exposure is that of your suppliers, and your customers are exposed by what you're exposed to. So firms who aren't directly required to meet certain disclosures can still drive value for their customers, for others in their value chain, by having a handle and understanding and mitigating their own risk. So again, just emphasizing this is something we're seeing in the US too, though maybe a little further behind from what we're seeing in the EU.
One of our largest customer bases is the asset management, investment management space. And I think they are really advanced in thinking about climate risk across multiple different stages, I guess, of their investment life cycle. Those that are really advanced are embedding climate risk into pre-transaction due diligence processes and even into pricing strategies. They are sitting down regularly with their team to think about portfolio resilience planning, so that asset level adaptation strategy. How can we, let's say an asset is exposed to heat stress, how can we think about asset level interventions like implementing HVAC systems or even flood barriers when there could be flood risk? And then the final stage in terms of divestment strategies, when is it time to divest from this particular asset and how does it impact the price or the value of that asset? So those that are ahead of the game are really thinking about it at multiple different stages of an investment life cycle.
Thank you for sharing that example, Kate. I wanted to touch upon something that Amanda had just teased up, which is you mentioned the word scenario analysis. And I want to understand that better. Maybe, John, you can help us understand what is scenario analysis?
Yeah, sure. So fundamentally, when it comes to scenario analysis, we need to understand that climate change is a future phenomenon. And so therefore we are modeling the future. And that's where scenario analysis comes in really handy. Frankly, you can think of a scenario as a potential future. And the way that EarthScan works and the way that, frankly, most climate risk providers will demonstrate their analysis is through the lens of one of these potential futures, because the future is inherently uncertain. And so therefore we've provided three different models. The first of which is a Paris-aligned future, which is quote unquote the best case, and that's what EarthScan provides you. Now, we're all sustainability professionals on this call. We all read that recently, potentially we've already gone past the barrier of a Paris-aligned future. Hopefully we can, resurrect that future. But what we also do is provide two further different scenarios. Those scenarios are an emissions peak in 2040, very much says what it does on the tin. And that is where emissions will peak at that date and will slowly, over the course of the 21st century, start to reduce those emissions to a much greater degree. But what we also include is quote unquote the worst case, and that's a business as usual scenario. That is where frankly, we continue to pollute and we continue to increase our greenhouse gas emissions across the 21st century. And that is where we see some incredible risks, which will not only pose potential risks to business, but frankly, to human life and to prosperity. So I think really what it comes down to is, what is scenario analysis? It's the ability to be able to show different futures for climate change. And that's where climate risks become really important. It is also mandatory for a successful TCFD filing, a successful ISSB filing, and indeed a successful CSRD filing. Great acronyms. All you need to know about them is that they are climate risk regulations. But I'm sure in the show notes, we can put in what each one of them stands for.
I think each of them would need an encyclopedia, but yes, we will definitely include them in the show notes. Amanda, did you have something to add?
Yes, adding to that long acronym soup is the California regulation as well, which aligned to TCFD. But in addition to that, I just want to note what I love so much about the scenario analysis tool for someone who's getting into the space for the first time, approaching risk, is that it allows for planning given significant uncertainty. So rather than picking a future that you're betting on and saying, oh, let's hope we hit somewhere in the middle, or for all of our benefit, we're on the lower end of climate change, you can note for the public and for your stakeholders that, hey, we consider the resiliency of our business in a wide range of scenarios. So regardless of how the future evolves, we are prepared. We have mitigation strategies available. So it enables planning even in a context of high uncertainty like what we're experiencing with climate change.
My next question is, what does a good scenario analysis look like? And it kind of is this question of, I've read many qualitative disclosures on climate risk. I know there's also some companies, some leaders seem like they're going in the more quantitative side. So the question I think to the team is, when is qualitative scenario sufficient? Check the box, let's say. And when do we really need to dig into the quantitative scenario analysis? When is that critical or imperative? John, you want to kick us off?
I think, look, I don't want to disparage anybody who is voluntarily putting forward regulation. I think that is, worthwhile in and of itself. Having said that, qualitative will only ever give you part of the answer. And if qualitative is all that you're engaging with, then you're not engaging with the quantitative analysis that is happening on a global scale by scientists annually as part of the IPCC reporting infrastructure. So potentially it leaves yourself open to not understanding the full breadth and depth of the risks that are associated with climate change. That's why it's important to do quantitative analysis. We work with a platform called EarthScan, which provides this data for individual organizations so that they can look at any specific year under any specific scenario in the 21st century for specific risks. So let's take that an example. We can look under the business as usual scenario in the year 2050 for a particular asset in, let's just say, Houston, Texas, and understand to what depth we would likely see a flood event, or to what extent a drought would be in number of days. As Amanda highlighted, we also provide an uncertainty barrier because, frankly, if I could predict the future, I would be buying lottery tickets tomorrow. But I can't do that. What I can do is provide the full breadth of quantitative analysis across all these different factors. What that means ultimately is that what we can do for customers is provide around 21,000 different data points for any single asset that they own on Earth.
I also might come in here. Your first question, Amanda, was what is the business case? And without having the quantitative data, it's very difficult to build that business case internally. And this isn't just the how much hotter, wetter, windier, drier it's going to be, but also how does this equate to financial losses? How does that flood depth equate to climate value at loss? And that is how, frankly, the whole business world speaks. And therefore, that's why businesses are being asked of that financial quantification. It is very complex to do that across a portfolio, across all different climate hazards. We at Scan, we offer that for our acute hazards on the platform. But it is what the industry is demanding. And ultimately, the whole point of disclosures is for shareholders to understand how climate could impact the share price, the market price of an organization. So we need to start thinking about how we can speak in their terms. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is something that we're working with to provide via the platform, and then work with the likes of ClimeCo to help us provide that narrative to organizations.
Is CSRD or the US SEC or the California law, are they requiring a certain type of scenario analysis, or are they leaving it up to companies to try to figure it out?
In the TCFD, it requires multiple scenario analysis. It doesn't say 2 or 3. We provide 3 because those 3 particular scenarios are the most modeled scenarios across all the different data sets that can be analyzed globally. There are other types of scenarios that can be included, but because the data is more scarce on a global level, we don't include it in our scan. So therefore, these 3 scenarios represent the most data-rich analyses that you can get currently. I would love science to get even better so that we can look at multiple different scenarios, but right now, these 3 are our best bet.
And I'll chime in from the California and SEC side. So California, currently, the Senate bill just says aligned to TCFD. So everything John just mentioned is also covered. Though following litigation and following action from the California Air Resources Board, we may see more details on exactly what they want to see with additional regulation coming out. So still evolving in this space, but I think it's a safe bet to align with best practice on TCFD. For SEC, though, they made a point in the final rules to not specifically require a scenario analysis, but instead to say, if you have used one to identify your climate-related risks, please disclose the approach you used. And I think going back to something that Kate said, a lot of firms may want to take a more risk-averse approach and rely on a scenario analysis, even for SEC, because again, it allows you to leverage better models, better climate data. And if you're putting this in an SEC disclosure, I would like to think a lot of firms want the best quality data available, best climate models undergirding the assessments that they're using for their own risk. So it depends on each firm's approach comes to the SEC, but I think there's definitely a case to be made for leveraging really high quality data and leveraging best practice scenarios.
I think my final question just to the group is that for any company who's on this journey, whether it's their first perhaps foray into understanding their climate risk, or maybe they've gotten some basics down, they're ready for that next level to really deep dive into their, what are some, maybe you can just popcorn around, but what would be a few recommendations of how you would advise them? Kate, you want to start?
Sure. I would say start. This is only going to get more complex. We're seeing regulation get harder on organizations on a yearly basis. There are many challenges, and I do actually find this space a very friendly space where people are willing to share their challenges, their learnings. So build a community, try and find out what's worked best, but also work with those that are, partner with people, partner with tools, partner with organizations that are going to help you with that first step. Climate science and climate risk reporting is incredibly complicated. Unless you have a climate science team, which most organizations don't, work with others to help make that first step as easy as possible.
Thank you. Amanda, what would you say?
So I'd break it up into two pieces. So one is leveraging best practice externally, very much related to what Kate mentioned, but people have been working in this space for a while. There is incredible data out there, incredible models out there to be leveraged and used. So again, leverage what's out there to benefit your firms. And then I'd say looking internally, gain allies. This ideally is not an activity siloed in a sustainability group, but instead is something that firms approach in an integrated way that's embedded into their enterprise risk management processes. So even if a firm is addressing climate risk for the first time, there is already risk management available in firms. And the more that can be integrated and a part of an existing process, the stronger it will be.
Wonderful. And John, anything to close us out? Any advice?
I would just suggest to be ambitious when it comes to climate risk and regulation. The ambition there is not only to talk to different stakeholders internally and externally, but once you get hold of this data and you start to increase your understanding of it, there is fantastic use cases and not just reporting and regulation. Often what we see is that is the first use case that people come to a tool or a platform like Earthscan for, but it evolves from there. People suddenly start to understand how useful it is for education across a business, how useful it is to compare against different benchmarks, and how you can change strategies based off of this information. Utilize it with information that you already have, and suddenly it becomes even more powerful.
Thank you all so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. John, Kate, Amanda, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.